The issue of the electoral system and processes was also discussed and is one of the major challenges that we all are facing in the transition. Also, the importance and role of media in supporting the transition to democracy and how to regulate it. Six, the reform of important institutions, especially the security and police forces. How can we make use of experience of other countries that have actually built these institutions on basis of respect and adhering to human rights? Seven, the decisions related to the economic wealth and resources distribution and how to go about it and how to build a consensus also on this redistribution. On the value issues, the whole issue of societal consensus, inclusiveness, finding common grounds, also should it be unconditional dialogue. And one very important thing is the sequence of processes. We need, in the final analysis, also to think what suits our local context, but what before what and what after what is something that we're all, I think, very concerned with in the transition to democracy, like, I mean, parliamentary election first or constitution writing first in Egypt. Also the definition of public inclusion and I mean the focus on the representation of youth and how can it be done, and also the move from online to offline as we see in this part of the world. The role of the institutions such as the human centers or human councils for human rights that do exist in our part and should be really playing a major role in the transition to democracy. So this actually what I could capture as some of the main challenges and issues that cut across, I think, all countries. And I've received one question, which is, in case of South Africa, how to avoid exclusion, discrimination in all forms during transition, especially when laws have not changed, as well as societal culture. So this is a question to you, Geraldine. If you can answer.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the question, and I'd also just like to make a few broader comments. I'd want to say the question itself was how to deal with exclusion in the instance of transition, especially if laws have not been changed. I mean, there was very clearly a process to try and ensure the amendment of immediate laws, very clearly those that were discriminatory to the degree that it had ensured the ongoing entrenchment of apartheid and the separation of people by race and otherwise. And the process had actually started from the late 80s, from around, I think it's 89, Comrade Albie, into the early 90s, to ensure that there would be the abolition of those laws that had entrenched what was considered petty apartheid. The major, the changing of laws was an ongoing process and very clearly was one of the major challenges that confronted the Ministry of Justice and the new government as from post-1994, because the overall changes of laws that were embedded across society took a longer time. What happened in the interim, I think it's very clear and it's known that in the 80s as well, there was a popular process to actually completely delegitimize those laws that was in place to was in place implementing or to uphold apartheid. And I'll give examples of some of them. I mean, from as early as in the 70s, and here I was in my teens at that point in time, there was the situation where there was sort of separation in public places, which included buses, toilets, shops, everything. I mean, apartheid in essence impacted on every aspect of your life completely. I mean, it's almost difficult to believe at this point. But we simply decided that we were not going to comply, because it was at the age of 14 when, for example, I sat in a part of the bus that was reserved for whites only. Similarly, in 1976, on the 16th of December, black South Africans occupied white beaches. That date was also particularly significant because it was a day of prayer, so to speak, for white South Africa, in the sense that they were praying for those that were on the borders, trying to to preserve apartheid in terms of their actions across borders as well. The 80s saw this to a greater degree, and the whole popular movement to render the country ungovernable was a way where the populace said, we are not going to accept that. So we didn't wait for the laws to change. We also engaged in a manner to render those laws, so to speak, ungovernable. But very clearly a process accompanied it to overcome that. I'd want to, in that process, just reflect on one or two other issues, if you don't mind. And the one point that I should make, that in event it's misunderstood, that with the Constituent Assembly process, there was a public participation process where once the broad principles were determined that would inform the Constitution, there was an advert requesting responses from the public. And there were about 2.5 million written responses. In addition to that, there was more than 150,000 inputs that had come through various body structures and individuals. And the big challenge that we confronted with the Constituent Assembly process was, how do you integrate all these submissions? And I think this is also something that will very clearly be one that needs to be confronted here, because not only will people submit it in writing using traditional media, but they'll also do so using social media and otherwise. So I can imagine that those numbers will be much higher. And as a result, the Constitutional Committee worked out criteria on what should be included in the Constitution. Again, that's something that can be discussed a lot more. Further, on popular participation, there was also a process prior to the election, sort of during the CODESA process, where women themselves wanted to ensure that the voice of women would not be left out of the new constitution-making process. And they, as women, we developed what was called a Women's Charter. And the Women's Charter was a process that involved women across party, ideological, and other lines, where you had women from civil society bodies, community women engaging in this process. But I think we should also note that the South African commitment to constitution making is one that goes way back, and some argues is almost as old as the Union. I'm sorry that I'm digressing a bit, but I think it also shows, you know, the kind of process that comes through. I'd also secondly want to, just in relation to one comment that was made, that there are institutions in the Arab states, some of the institutions that are institutions that should be protecting and defending human rights, like human rights bodies, etc. I think the big issue as well is not only about putting institutions in place, but ensuring that the institutions are true to the basis that had led to its formation. And here I'd want to just quote, and I'm going to digress a bit, just draw on a quote from de Tocqueville, where de Tocqueville says, and I quote, "The most dangerous moment for a bad government is generally that in which it sets about to reform," close quotes. And that particular process is because the nature of reform is such that imagine when you open the sluice gates of a dam, or let's imagine it's a tsunami coming, and this reform is like a tsunami. I mean, it wipes, it could possibly wash away everything that's there, the walls, all structures, substructures and all. And it's demolishing lesser structures. And it's how do you ensure that if you want to tinker, I mean, in essence, I'm saying you can't really tinker. You need to look at how you take that change forward, because it's about ensuring that changes are deep-rooted and should be what's required. Am I allowed one more minute, or is my time up? 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay, let me put it this way. Youth have always historically been part of revolutions. It's not a new phenomenon. I think what has made it quite a phenomenon is the extent and the wave that's been there in the Arab states. And I think what's important is you've captured that space, don't lose it. There's nothing that says that youth cannot and should not be part of processes post. And I think you capturing that space and want to ensure that role, and it should be entrenched going forward. A last thing as well is media has also been a key part of any revolution. It's just the kind of media that's there, social media, and of course the fact that mobile technology has exploded in recent times beyond any of our expectations. And I think to a large degree we also need to ensure that we use these channels of communication in such a manner that it can optimize and capture a space that was previously closed, because now there are no hallowed grounds anymore. I'll pause now and listen.
Thank you. Okay, the question is to Mexico about the regulations that Mexico is imposing on the financing of parties as well as the allocation of airtime on radio and television. Is there an authority that monitors the respect of parties to these regulations, and what are the type of penalties imposed in case of infractions?
De manera muy puntual, para crear partidos en México que tengan derechos, que puedan participar en elecciones, la ley es precisa en los requisitos. Señala cuál es el número de ciudadanos que deben estar afiliados a la organización que pretenda obtener el derecho a participar en elecciones. Por ejemplo, cifra cerrada, gruesa, México exige para un partido político nuevo alrededor de 250,000 afiliados, 250,000. Claro, ¿por qué un número es grande, es pequeño? Hay que compararlo. México es un país de 110 millones de habitantes y su listado de electores, el número de ciudadanos inscritos en los listados para votar, ya se acerca a los 85 millones de personas. Entonces, para un nuevo partido se requieren 250,000 ciudadanos como uno de los requisitos. Otro es hacer asambleas, reuniones en presencia de la autoridad electoral que dé fe de que eso tiene lugar y se hace conforme a la ley. Entonces hay un catálogo de requisitos puntuales que la autoridad electoral, que en México es un instituto autónomo, el Instituto Federal Electoral, vigila y supervisa. Tenemos una singularidad. En México, por disposición de la ley, solamente se abre, así se dice en México, se permite por ley crear nuevos partidos, registrarlos cada 6 años. el derecho de crear partidos está regulado en la ley y solamente después de la elección presidencial es posible solicitar el registro de nuevos partidos. Esto tiene que ver con la historia de nuestra propia transición. Hubo muchos partidos en el arranque de la transición, durante los años de la transición. Cuando digo muchos me refiero a que hubo alrededor de 20 partidos que obtuvieron su registro legal, participaron en elecciones, pero no cubrieron el mínimo de votación que la ley exige para mantenerse como partido. Entonces, muy probablemente tengamos este mismo tipo de coyunturas en los fenómenos que ustedes están viviendo en Egipto, en otros países, en los cuales en el arranque hay muchos partidos y luego eso se va reduciendo porque o bien hay alianzas entre los partidos que se van creando, o bien la sociedad, a través del voto, los ciudadanos van decidiendo qué partidos deben tener permanencia y cuáles no. Obviamente no podríamos imaginar sistemas de partidos integrados por 150 o 200 partidos políticos, eso en ninguna democracia es posible. Entonces sí tenemos una regulación muy estricta, muy puntual, y la hace cumplir la autoridad electoral. Respecto de radio y televisión y de estas nuevas leyes que se crearon en el año 2007, es la propia autoridad electoral la que vigila que se cumpla la Constitución y la ley en materia de radio y televisión. Y para ese propósito, la autoridad electoral implantó en México un sistema de verificación de todas las estaciones de radio y todos los canales de televisión que se difunden en México, que tienen su origen en el territorio mexicano. Esos canales de televisión y esas estaciones de radio son grabadas 24 horas del día, todos los días del año. Si se detecta propaganda violatoria de la norma constitucional, la autoridad electoral de inmediato ordena que se suspenda, lo ordena directamente a las televisoras y abre una investigación. Y las multas son tanto para las televisoras o radiodifusoras, las empresas, como para los partidos. ¿De qué montos de multas estamos hablando? Ahora mismo la autoridad electoral está discutiendo la multa a un partido, a uno de los partidos mexicanos, el Partido Verde, the Green Party, por violación de la norma constitucional, y la multa que la autoridad electoral propone imponerle es de $26 millones americanos. Esa es la multa. Y a las televisoras, por ejemplo, una de las dos grandes televisoras de México ha acumulado desde la entrada en vigor de la reforma constitucional hasta esta fecha multas por un total de alrededor de $15 millones que le ha impuesto la autoridad electoral. Entonces, la autoridad tiene los medios técnicos y tecnológicos para verificar que se cumpla la Constitución y se cumpla la ley, pero además dispone por ley, de la posibilidad de imponer sanciones económicas muy fuertes, muy cuantiosas. Y en un extremo, la autoridad electoral podría decidir cancelar el permiso, la concesión, si la violación la comete la empresa. Y si la violación es grave y la comete el partido, entonces la autoridad electoral puede cancelar el registro de ese partido, o sea, suspenderlo y cancelarle todos sus derechos, sacarlo, en pocas palabras, de la contienda y del sistema. A ese grado llega el rigor de lo que se construyó en 2007. Se ha trabajado en esto, se está probando. Déjenme concluir con una reflexión final. Creo que por experiencia todos sabemos que en el arranque de las transiciones, en los procesos de cambio, las demandas de la sociedad surgen se acumulan, unas ya se sabían, otras quedan al descubierto por la caída de los regímenes que ocultaban la realidad, que tenían sistemas autoritarios. Surgen muchas demandas. No todas son urgentes. Puede ser que todas sean importantes, pero no todas son urgentes. Distinguir lo urgente, saber que en ese mapa de ruta del que aquí se ha hablado, no todo puede ir al mismo tiempo, quizás sea también una de las claves para avanzar. Pretender resolverlo todo en un solo momento es ilusorio, pero es sobre todo imposible. Va a haber que construir, hacer la lista, no solamente de las demandas, de las exigencias, sino también de la secuencia para irlas atendiendo. Y saber que la democracia no va a resolverlo todo, que no es a la democracia a la que le debemos pedir que genere riqueza, que genere empleo, que acabe con la pobreza, que tengamos en nuestros países mejor educación, mejor salud. Lo vamos a poder hacer mucho más rápido y mejor si tenemos democracia. De eso yo no tengo la menor duda. Pero no le pidamos a la democracia, y eso nos pasó en América Latina, que resuelva todo, porque entonces al paso del tiempo las sociedades ven que en democracia persisten problemas, persiste desempleo, persiste injusticia, persiste pobreza. Y entonces viene lo que ahora se está llamando en América Latina, esto lo ha trabajado a detalle el PNUD en América Latina, sobreviene lo que ahora se llama la desilusión, la decepción sobre la democracia. Y yo termino diciendo, para que no generemos después desilusión sobre la democracia, no ilusionemos a nuestros ciudadanos sobre cosas que no toca a la democracia resolver. Aprendamos todos a valorar la democracia por lo que vale en sí misma, por lo que tiene de importante para nuestro presente, para nuestro futuro, pero sobre todo para el futuro de las nuevas generaciones, de nuestros hijos y de quienes hoy aquí en Egipto están protagonizando el cambio. Muchas gracias.
Okay, so the question is, why do you think that decentralization is a priority and how should it happen? Basically, I think that decentralization is a priority for a couple of reasons. Egypt's state has been growing in terms of power, in terms of centralization over the past, since the early 1800s, but more significantly in the second half of the 20th century. And this gigantic state, has led to the disempowerment of civil society. If you look at even the traditional social structure of Egypt, if you look at the merchant guilds, if you look at the Sufi orders, if you look at religious institutions, including Al-Azhar and the Coptic Church, all these institutions have been disempowered and have been politicized to serve the objectives or the goals or the interests of the regime. Why did this happen? It happened because the centralization leads to accumulation of power at the central authority, and I mean this does not, we don't have the sufficient infrastructure of checks and balances and so forth, and therefore this leads to jeopardizing all the civil rights of the people and so forth. Two important phenomena here, we should look at two important phenomena. Number one, the politicization of religious institutions. And we see that during the revolution, both Al-Azhar and the Coptic Church took a stance against the revolution, which tells you how the strong central state has managed to instrumentalize religion to serve its purposes. Second is that we only see sectarian and ethnic conflicts in Egypt, or issues in the existence of this strong central state. So the Bedouins are not a problem until we have this strong central state. The Nubians are not a problem until we have this strong central state. The Muslim-Christian religious tension is only a problem also under this strong central state. Why is that? Because this strong state suppresses identity. It aims at creating a universal identity for the entire population. And this is not a healthy thing in any way. I mean, it disempowers people, but it also makes anybody who's in any type of a minority, be it a religious minority or an ethnic minority, feel alienated. And we don't need to see that. And decentralization does not harm the harmony of the Egyptian people, because we do share a lot in common, and we don't need to suppress our differences so as to feel as we are one nation. So this is why I think that decentralization is of extreme importance, at least on the long term. How should this come about? It should come about, I mean, the normal procedure. It should start by constitutional clauses that would encourage this or allow for this decentralization, the empowerment of the local population, through even through the tools that we have at the moment, starting even with municipal councils and so forth, just giving them, I mean, more power and more significance. And then that's another process that takes time, but it should start by constitutional amendments or changes in the constitution.
The question is, how should a country like Egypt keep refugee issues on the table while other matters seem more pressing? Example, reinstitutionalization. Shall I repeat the question? Okay. How should a country like Egypt keep refugee issues on the table while other matters seem more pressing? Example, reinstitutionalization. First of all, Egypt, like many other countries, is a signatory to many of the international conventions and treaties that deal with refugees. And I think my own personal opinion is that the National Council for Human Rights in Egypt has the primary responsibility on keeping refugee issues on the table, being a vulnerable group within society. The issues, the laws and legislations and policies related to the daily lives of the ordinary Egyptian citizen, these are issues that should be tackled in a sensitive way, because whatever rights are given to those refugees in terms of education, residency, health, otherwise would have an impact on the lives of the ordinary citizen. And I think we also should differentiate between refugees in general and Palestinian refugees. And I say this because in dealing with Palestinian refugees, like in the case of Jordan, there are many challenges. First of all, how much the percentage of the Jordanian population are Palestinians. Second of all, the threat of Jordan being an alternative homeland to the Palestinian, I mean instead of Palestine, and that's an international threat. I do not think Egypt has that threat like Jordan does. And therefore, I really believe that our foreign policy should really focus on the right to return, the two-state solution, the compensation for the individual as well as the hosting countries. I mean, we need to be pragmatic, and I think this is one of the issues that will come up after the General Assembly in September, when supposedly the Palestinian state will be declared by the General Assembly of the UN, and therefore would enjoy the observer state status like the Holy See. This is when I think the frustrations of Palestinian refugees will escalate, because by then there will be a recognition, I think, of the Palestinian state, but no state to go back to. Thank you.